My name's Stephen Downey, and you are very welcome to episode 48 of the Mindful Living Guide. Very close to the 50. Really excited about that. Listen, thank you so much for taking time to listen. This week we have an amazing episode. I am talking to a man called Daragh Fleming. He is a mental health ambassador. He is a writer, a poet, and an author. And he's just an all-around great person who is breaking down the stigma in mental health, open up conversations, and you'll really enjoy this. If we talk a lot about men's mental health actually, and just the things that stop us from talking about that inner feminine that a lot of men are afraid to talk about. We also talk about an incident that happened to Daragh recently, and how his strength in his own mental health was allowed him to get through this very difficult time. Listen, it's a great episode. I really enjoyed my time chatting to Daragh, and I hope we get to talk again in the future. Sit back and enjoy this week's episode of the Mindful Living Guide. Very welcome to this great episode of the Mindful Living Guide with Daragh Fleming. Daragh is an author, freelance writer, award-winning mental health blogger from Cork in Ireland. Some will say the real capital. We'll have to discuss that in the podcast. And also part-time Spider-Man. Daragh, you're very welcome to the Mindful Living Guide.
That's an absolutely excellent introduction. Anytime me and Spider-Man are in the same sentence is a good day. So thank you very much.
For anyone who's not familiar with this, just recently, Daragh was sharing on his Instagram him in a Spider-Man suit. Was it an Iron Man competition you were at?
Yeah, that's right. My friend was running it. It was his second time running it, but he's also quite a big Spider-Man fan. So I said I'd surprise him with the suit.
Oh, fair play to you. And listen, for anyone who's not familiar with you, do you mind kind of just give me a kind of background on yourself? And I know I said that you're a mental health blogger, but I just think from people in Ireland that ask about mental health and what people are out there, I think it's so important to start these conversations, and people like yourself that are out there opening up this whole world to people that it used to be a taboo to talk about our mental health, but now it's a strength. It's to show that vulnerability. So can you give us a bit of background about yourself and how you got to here?
Yeah, 100%. Always a tricky thing to do, but I'll give it my best shot. So yeah, I'm a writer primarily. That's kind of my trade. I've written a collection of short stories, have a collection of essays on mental health called Lonely Boy, do a bit of poetry. But what I started with the blogging, which is kind of like, it's interesting over the last few years has changed so much because, people's attention span is quickly draining. So it's kind of switched more to video content than writing content. Now, I still do the writing every week for the blog, but it's kind of more of a video-based blog now, which is interesting. So I do that. I work with a charity called A Lust for Life as their head of content. As we were talking about before, I'm an ambassador with Sea Change Ireland, which is a charity dedicated to reducing stigma around mental health. And yeah, my whole thing is just normalizing the conversation around mental health and getting people to a place where they feel safe and comfortable talking about their mental health and their emotions. And that's pretty much what I try to do in all the work I'm involved in, whether it be public speaking, writing, doing the videos. Yeah, that's pretty much what I do, what I try to do, and so far so good.
Brilliant. And you're making a big impact. Like you're talking to lots of people. I know your book you mentioned there as well is out, and I just think it's amazing that the transition you were saying that you started off in doing a lot more writing, but like you said, like people's attention spans are so short nowadays that it's all just quick TikToks, quick kind of Instagram reels and that really are catching people's attention. Um, do you think it's with that kind of form? Do you think it's easier to start these conversations and for people to actually talk more about their mental health?
Yeah, I think because of we can talk all day about the pros and cons of social media, but one of the big positives is that people are exposed to a lot more people with a lot more diverse of opinions, and as a result of that, like you just naturally come across people talking about a variety of different emotional and mental health topics. And like there's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have the expertise or the experience in talking about. Like, for example, one of the key things I do with Thoughts Too Big is I talk about my own experience. So as a result of that, I don't talk about things like schizophrenia or bipolar because I don't have experience with those things. And I think someone who has that experience should be the one to talk about them. But you can find someone who is talking about that with social media. So it has become far more. Um, there's just far more content and far more people talking, which always the more people are talking, the more people are going to talk. So I think that's been a huge benefit in the last few years, especially since the pandemic, that we're seeing a lot more people just talking about their own experiences, and that allows and welcomes and invites other people to do the same, which is great.
It opens up those conversations. Do you mind just talking about your own struggles actually that you've had in the past? And I know you lost a very close friend when you were very young as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's kind of how it all started for me. Like before, my friend took his own life in 2012, and before that, I wouldn't have known what mental health was at all. Like it wasn't really brought up. If it was brought up, it was in hushed tones behind closed doors. We don't really talk about it. So, and I lived in a very happy bubble. You know, I have a great family, great support system, had a great childhood, which I'm very grateful for, and I know that's a privilege. But so that I just never touched my life, and suicide to me was always something that happened to other people in other places, and then it took my best friend, and that kind of woke me up to like this could just happen to anyone. Like it's not for other people who are in different circumstances. This could happen to absolutely anyone, and that was quite scary. Um, and obviously, like he was my best friend, so and I didn't know he was struggling, so that left me with feelings of a lot of guilt and shame that I didn't know he was hurt, so I didn't know I could help him or how I could help him. And even if I had that knowledge that he was hurting, I wouldn't have known what to do because we didn't have any education around it. Um, so when he died, there was a very long grief period, a lot of different emotions. There was anger, guilt, sadness, kind of a lack of any joy or seeing the point in life, because I was like, what's the point in going on? Like my best friend's gone, like there's nothing left. Um, and the grief morphed into depression for me, but again, because of the lack of talk around mental, because this was almost 11 years ago now, the lack of conversation around mental health and the lack of education, I didn't know what depression was. And in my head, depression was that you're sad all the time. And I wasn't experiencing that. I was experiencing numbness. So I wasn't feeling sad, but I also wasn't feeling angry, wasn't feeling happy, I wasn't feeling anything. And this I was 17, 18, went into college, just kind of existed in this way for 2 to 3 years, and then started learning about depression in college. And I was like, that actually sounds a lot like me. But because of like self stigma, I denied it. I was like, no, that's not. Even though I knew, like in kind of in my gut, that I was depressed, I was like, no, that's not me. I can't be depressed. Because I was afraid that I'd go down the same route as my friend. So my answer to that was to deny the fact that I was feeling the way I was feeling. Um, and then in second year of college, it kind of all came to a head where I had a panic attack in the middle of the street with my friends. And, you know, from my understanding, that was because I was repressing and ignoring a lot of emotions. And, you know, there's a famous Sigmund Freud quote that says, unexpressed emotions don't just go away, they come back worse later. So I had the panic attack, and that was my first one. And it was after that that I decided I'd go and get help. And I went to counseling, got the diagnosis. And it's just after that, I was just being aware that I had depression, how to deal with it, when to know if it was coming back. And I suppose after that then is when I started Toss Too Big and started the work we're still doing today. But it was very much it's strange, like I don't know your own experience with if you've had depression, but depression's quite challenging because when you're in it, you don't really know the extent of how much it's affecting you. Because when I wasn't feeling emotion, I also wasn't feeling fear of not feeling emotion. I was like, oh, this is fine. This is just how people feel. It was only when I came out of it and I started feeling emotions again that I realized how terrifying it was to live without emotion. Because you're not really living, you're just existing. You're going through the motions. Nothing's really affecting you on a deep level. Everything's surface. And that's not really living. And when I came out of it, that really stuck with me of how terrifying that is a way to live. And often you don't even realize
I
how
think
bad it is
you
until you're able
describe it
to.
so well there when you said the numbness.
Mm,
I went through a difficult patch, and it's funny the way these things don't happen straight away. For me, it was a kind of a delay of about 2 years after my brother passed away, and we had to go through a court case, and there was a lot of stuff happened that it wasn't until all that was finished that I think your body is kind of on auto drive that it hit me in my experience. And but I don't hear it all. It's described often as numbness, and it's such a great way to describe it because at the time you lose track of who you are
mm,
because you have no emotions, and it's a hard place to be in.
because I think, often when we talk about depression, we talk about the negative things you're feeling. So you're feeling, self contempt, and you're feeling, lack of emotion. But I think what's as important is to address the things you're not feeling. So you're not feeling joy, you're not feeling excited, you're not feeling any of the things that make life enjoyable. You're feeling negative things, but you're also not feeling positive things, and that's, I think, where the numbness comes from, because you're not getting any on any spectrum of the emotional, or any point on the emotional spectrum. You're not really landing on it, you're just outside of it. And for me,
There,
and I've addressed this in my writing in different ways, like it felt like people were living life and I could see them, but I was just outside of it watching it happen, and I couldn't really get into how everyone else was just getting on with their lives.
it's like you're just an observer in your own life.
Mm-hmm. Which is
The
terrifying.
it's something else that you actually mentioned there, and it's actually true to work with Sea Change. Kind of, I've seen this a lot myself because when I went to, I was an ambassador with them for a couple of years, and they obviously their whole agenda is to kind of break down the stigma, and a lot of people think that stigma is about what somebody thinks of somebody else with mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, there's so much self stigma as well
Mm-hmm.
that we bring upon ourselves as well, that we kind of say, well, I can't get help because if I get help, then I have to admit that there's something wrong, and if there's something wrong, I could be as bad as something. And it's a kind of a it's a pattern kind of that can form in this self stigma.
Yeah, and I think, self stigma is kind of informed by stigma that's just in society. So I think the self stigma I was placing on myself was informed by just the general atmosphere of, like, well, having a mental health problem is bad, and people do treat people with mental health problems differently. So then I was putting that stigma on myself, because I was like, if I have a mental health problem, then that's bad. And if I have it, then people are going to treat me differently, and they're going to walk on eggshells around me, and they mightn't like me as much. And it was all that fear of the stigma that I was just subconsciously aware of, that was out in society, and then placing that on myself. I was like, no, in my head, there was something wrong with having a mental health problem. And that was a huge part of the reason I didn't seek help earlier. Like, I had it for 3 years before I started looking for help, and that it had to get to a very bad point before that happened. So, and
And
that's, based in societal stigma for sure.
I think it's so important that why it's important for men to have conversations like this
Mm-hmm.
to kind of leave it in 3 years and leave it for like 3 years before you look for help. Or I know in my case as well that I left it until I literally collapsed that I had to look for help. I remember my wife kind of looking at me, and I think I collapsed. No, sorry, this was a different part of it. But
Mm-hmm.
I remember actually I was sitting outside my car, and the anxiety was so bad I didn't want to go to work. And she actually came out to work about 10 minutes later, and I was sitting there crying in my car.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't able to tell her there was something wrong, but she just looked at me and said, "Come on, we're going to the doctor. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
get this looked at." And it was just, I don't know what it is about men that we just feel it's so hard to ask for help. Maybe
Yeah.
it's a vulnerability thing that we don't want to be vulnerable.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of things. And, I think, just to highlight before I move on, like, having, obviously, your wife is clearly a very supportive person, and having that support system to do the thing you can't do, I think, is super important, and that shouldn't be underappreciated. But yeah, I think there's a lot of issues with men in mental health. I think, their masculinity has been linked to emotion in a negative way, in that like if you express emotion or if you express vulnerability, and that's seen as a masculine weakness. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot in recent weeks, that like I think what's happening is we're conflating um masculinity with, or like we're conflating expressing emotion as a bad thing rather than seeing it as embracing our feminine side. And I think that's the problem men face, is that we don't embrace that feminine side. And we do all have one, like as in every person has masculine energy and feminine energy. And I think the issue with men is that we're either through socialization or through how we're brought up, or the generational, just how men are, like the traditional gender roles, we've been conditioned to um refuse to embrace our feminine side. And our feminine side is that compassion, it's that empathy, it's that embracing your emotion and expressing them. So I think there's not exactly an issue with masculinity, because there's some very positive masculine traits. I think it's just that we're not embracing that feminine side and not allowing ourselves to be emotional, because we think it somehow impacts our identity as men, which is nonsense.
It
And
doesn't take
that's
anything from us. It's yeah.
Yeah, and that I think that's the issue. And then because like, and even like I do a lot of like poetry work, and I do the videos for poetry, and like the amount of people who, because I'm expressing emotion um openly and honestly and through poetry, just assume that I'm a gay man because of that. So like it's our society right now, it's almost preposterous to think that a straight man could be expressing emotion. So if a man is expressing emotion, oh, then he's probably gay, because a straight man could never do that. And that's where we are. That's where our discourse is with men and emotion, is that like it's literally unfeasible that a straight man could express his emotions
Yeah.
in a healthy way.
It's it's amazing that you say that. It's something I'd never thought of, and it's so true. It's like I'm like I from a big family. My brother who passed away and my older brother, they're real alpha males working construction. I'm the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
and but it's so true that it's like a, is it what I say, a badge of dishonor to have a feminine side.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that I'm hoping that taboo is breaking, that times are changing,
Yeah.
and that kind of perspective is getting less and less. Um,
Yeah, definitely. I think, these things take time. And I think what's happened in the last 10 years is we've switched from like it's weak for men to show emotion, to actually encourage men to show emotion. Like men can talk, you should talk about your emotions. And
yeah,
that's really good. That's really positive. But because we have a like history of centuries of the opposite being true, it's going to take time for men to adjust. So just because we tell men it's okay to talk about their emotions, it's going to take time to get to a place where they actually do, because they're going to be hesitant. They're not going to believe that it's actually true that they can do this. It's going to feel uncomfortable. There's going to be a lot of stuff that they have to work through. So we're not going to see the full impact of what's already happened for another generation or so. And that's fine. But I think what we have to be careful about is not letting ourselves get impatient with men, because we're keep telling them they can express their emotion, and then they're reluctant to, or they're hesitant to, that we don't start getting impatient with men and move on from the mental health problem. We have to allow the time for the adjustment, and that's going to take probably a couple of decades. But for the time being, like people like myself, like yourself, like you have Blind Boy, you've the two Naris, you've Brezzy, all these people who are all these men who are actively trying to show that it's okay to talk about your mental health and your emotions. We will always need that, and that work's really important to keep the ball rolling in the right direction.
keep all those conversations flowing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, before I ask this question, I want to say it's very important for listeners as well, is that when we discuss anyone's mental health journey or anything that works for them, it's obviously not a prescription. It's something that everything that works for us is what works for us, and it's really an example of things that we can try. But what I wanted to ask is kind of before we even came on the call, you were saying you're in a good place now.
Mm-hmm.
What has worked for you in the past? Because we talked about your struggle. We talked about hard times that you had, but what has brought you out of those hard times into the good times?
Yeah, it's a good question, and like just to I suppose reinforce your point, like different things work for different people, and there's no like what works for me might be an absolute disaster for someone else's mental health, you know. So I think that that is a really important point to make. But for me, it's a combination of things. Writing has always been a place I can go to feel, to like understand my emotion, to process it, and then also has that element of like when you write something new, you feel like you've done something productive with your day, and doing some productive with your day for me always makes me feel better mentally. So writing has like first and foremost, like it's become my career, but first and foremost, it's a mental health tool for me. Like, um, and then on top of that, we have it's often like a lot of stuff that like you should do, you know, like things you might not necessarily want to do, but you should do because they make you feel better. So exercise is a huge one for me, and I often don't want to exercise, but it does. I know if I
Beat
go
your brother.
exercise, I will feel better. So that's a huge one. Getting enough sleep. I've been reading a lot about sleep lately, and I think it's something we take for granted because it's something we have to do. Like we can avoid exercising, we can't
Yeah.
avoid sleeping, but often we neglect sleep and we only allow ourselves 4 or 5 hours, and the detrimental effects of that are huge. So I do really prioritize getting 8 hours of sleep as often as I can. And then other stuff like, you know, drinking water, getting enough food in. And what I found, because I'm quite like happy to spend time on my own. And oftentimes I'm too happy to spend time on my own. And what happens is I'll spend too much time alone, and that's bad for my mental health. So I need to strike the balance between spending time on my own to do work and chill out, and also spend time socializing because that's really, really important for my mental health. Just to be around other people, to get out of my own head, and be around friends. So like trying to find that balance, and that's quite tricky. You know, everyone has their busy schedules, everyone has stuff going on, so it's finding striking that balance. Because if it goes too far in either direction, like if I'm spending too much time alone or if I'm spending too much time around people, that'll affect my mental health negatively. So it's just striking that balance. And then other stuff that works for me, like meditating, and that's probably an example of something that someone else might find is a nightmare situation. I know you're a big fan of it, but yeah, meditating is good for me. Reading, and then making time for stuff that I just silly things that I find enjoyable. Like I'm a huge Marvel fan, so I'll make sure I have a ticket to the Marvel movie when it's coming out, and that's
Brilliant.
something to look forward to. And it's just whatever you like. For me, looking after your mental health is doing. There's kind of two tiers. Doing the stuff you know you have to do that you're avoiding, so like exercising, sleeping, going to the dentist, whatever it is, doing the stuff you ought to be doing, and then it's doing the stuff that you know just brings you joy. They're the two tiers, and I try and do as much as in both tiers I can every day. And I think the consistency element is really important. So like the example I always give is like if I want to be absolutely shredded tomorrow, like if I want to be shredded, I can't just do a big workout today and expect to be shredded tomorrow. And I think mental health's very much the same way. Like if I just do a load of mental health stuff today and then for the next week I don't look after my mental health at all, I shouldn't expect my mental health to be good. You have to come to it every day and be active in looking after your mental health the same way we do with our physical health naturally. We just don't have this because the education or lack thereof, we don't have the same mindset when it comes to mental health. But for me, it's very much the same. I need to work on it every day in order for it to stay healthy.
And
Um,
it's important though to, as well the awareness. Like you were mentioned there at the start about that you love to spend time with yourself, but sometimes you spend too much. And
mhm.
I think it's also is about bringing that awareness of when the needle is going too far in one direction and we have to just bring it back. It's like you're saying about the balance but to be able to be aware of that is such a powerful tool. And it's a simple thing as well. It's about like checking in on ourselves and say, right, where
Yeah,
am I today?
exactly. Like, and it is that old trope, like everything in moderation. Like, exercise is good for you, but if you over exercise, you start to get injured, you start to get malnourished, your heart will be under pressure. Like, exercise is good for you, but if you do too much, it's bad for you. So, spending time on my own is good for me, but if I spend too much time on my own, it starts to become bad for me. So, it is very much like even though you enjoy this, if you do it too much, it will start to negatively impact you. And I think that's when you need to step away. And that can be difficult, especially if you're going through like a rough patch with anxiety or whatever, and you don't want to see people. It's forcing yourself. to do it, because you know at the end of the day you'll feel a little bit better because you haven't spent all day of every day with yourself, because that can be really difficult, especially like if I'm spending a lot of time on my own when I'm feeling particularly anxious. That's when the anxiety is the worst, because there's no one to like get me off the thought.
It's trying to break the pattern then at that
Yeah,
stage.
exactly.
It's one thing, like I think it's a strong like sense of it is that you've taken an ownership of your mental health
Mhm.
and an ownership of where you are in the moment. And there was something I was asking if it was okay to talk about, because I think it's so important. Something that came up recently, and I read it in the press that um, there was an incident where you were being blackmailed,
Mhm.
and it's in the papers, and I won't go into the full details of it. But I have to say what actually happened. I read this article and I read the reaction that you had,
Mhm.
and I actually stood up and I said, "Yes, that
Mhm.
isn't someone with strong mental health." My wife thought it was crazy, but then she read it, and um, basically what happened is that you took total ownership of the situation, and you said that this is the way it is. This is what might happen. But whereas a lot of people, and I'll let you go into it in a second yourself, but a lot of
Mhm.
people may have had a different reaction and worried about the outcomes instead of just saying, right, this is the way it is. I can take ownership right now, or I can worry about what might happen.
Yeah, yeah, no, like, and just for people who don't know, about a month ago now, someone I thought who was a real person who ended up being a catfish, blackmailed me with my own nude images. They wanted 2 grand in order to not send them to my family and friends, which I didn't do. And then, yeah, basically the reaction after the initial panic, because it was a lot of panic, a lot of stress, I was like, right. And this is kind of how I look at mental health in general. It's trying to find an element of control in a place where you're out of control. So I think the reason I've taken ownership over my mental health in general is because there's a lot of stuff I can't control. Like if something bad happens, that's going to affect my mental health, but I can do stuff day to day that I can control that will benefit my mental health. So that's kind of the same premise. So the pictures were no longer within my control. Someone else had them, and they were threatening to leak them. So I think the thing that was affecting me the most is that I didn't have control in this situation. So I was like, how do I take back control? And that was the decision then to be like, right, if I actually tell people before this person tells people, then I've taken the control back. So that's what I did. And then there was also elements of humor in my reaction, because I was like, because there's like, and a lot of people have shamed me. Like there was the commissioning editor for the Irish Medical Times, several trolls just shaming me, saying all this horrible stuff and victim blaming, because this is what happened to me is
Yeah.
classified as sexual abuse, so they're victim blaming me.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
um, and I think the best way I know to disarm shame is to bring humor into it. So in the tweet, I was like, someone's blackmailing me with my own nude images. They want 2 grand. I'm not going to pay them. So if you see those images, enjoy them, I suppose, because I'm not going to stop them from being published. And it was just bringing that element of humor into it, and that's kind of how I operate anyway. It just disarms the heaviness of a situation, and like objectively looking back now, it is kind of a hilarious situation. That it's just like, and like to me, it's hilarious. Obviously, like other people have like my personal experience has a bit of humor to it because that's how I handle it. But like that's not to take away the seriousness of this issue, because people have taken their own lives and people have gotten severely depressed and it's ruined people's lives. But I just thought I can use humor to take away anyone trying to shame me's power, like just strip him of it. I'm like, yeah, I know this is embarrassing and it's mortifying. I know that, and I'm showing you that by being funny about it. And um, I think that was the most, and it
Well,
was such a like instinctive like decision to make. But yeah, the feedback I've gotten from most people is that I handle it really well, and I'm quite proud of that. And the what's happened since then is that it's happened to like several people have reached out to me since it's happened to me, and they're like, this is now happening to me in this moment. Do you have any advice? What should I do? How do I handle it? And it's just giving people that because when it does happen to you, like it feels like the world's closing in. You feel like you're completely on your own, and going public about it. I guess the purpose of that is it lets people know that you can get through it. You're not the only one who's going through this. And that's the goal of all the work we do in mental health, is to let people know that they're not alone in whatever they're dealing with. And there's people who've reached out and they're like, okay, I was freaking out, but now I've seen your tweets and I've seen everything that was in the press, and now I don't feel as bad. So
And,
that's
and,
been really positive.
and just let them know that like there is a way through. It's like we're talking about the whole mental health conversation, but just opening up the conversation to say, right, this isn't the end of the world. And it's actually it's funny. I'm reminded I talk about this teaching many times on the podcast. There's a teaching in Buddhism called the two arrows,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole idea of it is that when you are shot, there's an initial arrow that comes in, and that causes the pain. There's bleeding. There's a lot of stuff happening, but often in life, we shoot a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth arrow, and we're kind of saying, "Well, oh, Jesus, if that goes down to my heart, then I'm going to die." And if
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's blood on my top, and that's my favorite top, and like I know I'm being facetious here, but like
Yeah.
there's many extra thoughts that happen. Like it's yeah, this situation happened, but it's actually it's all those other arrows that we fire at ourselves, those worries, those anxieties about what might happen. And again, just taking ownership has just it has changed it altogether.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think the biggest fear in that type of situation where someone's threatening with your naked images, they're very vulnerable images, is that people will find out. Like, oh, people are going to find this out and they're going to think differently of me. So then I was like, okay, but what if they found out from me? Like, if I said it with my chest and I was like, look, this has happened. This is a disaster. This is probably the worst thing that's ever happened to me, but it has happened. It's not my fault. And I'm letting you know rather than you hearing it from some random bot account on the internet. I was like, this is a disaster, but look, it is what it is. Because if I didn't do that, I know myself, I would have lived every day with the fear that people would find out about it, and the pictures would leak, and then they'd find out slowly, and they'd
Constantly looking
go,
over your shoulder.
yeah. And I just didn't want to live like that. So I was like, right, I'm just gonna do this, rip the band-aid off. And as each day passed and they didn't get leaked, it was obviously like a spam farm um that was doing this. So they moved on to the next victim. And as each day passed and they weren't leaked, I started to feel a little bit more calm and safe. And for the most part, in fairness, people were extremely supportive. Obviously, like with anything you put on the internet, there are some people who are incredibly nasty, but for the most part, people were positive, and that was really nice to see that people are compassionate.
And I think there is a lot of compassion. Like it's like it's I forget who said it to me a long time ago, but it's so true that like we have to accept in life sometimes that not everybody is going to like us,
Mm-hmm.
and when we put these things out, it's not always going to work,
Mm-hmm.
but you mentioned actually earlier on and moving on is that we mentioned meditation, and you were saying some people like it and some people don't. Is it part of your routine? Would you meditate much yourself or
Yeah, I try to do, even if I can get like at least 5 minutes in the morning just to like set myself, because I feel
yeah?
like what meditation does for me is it allows me to see where I am before I start reacting to the world. And it just creates, people, all the kind of experts talk about creating that gap. And you really, if you do it consistently, you do feel that gap between you and your reactions. And that lets me know that, like, okay, I'm feeling a little bit anxious today, or I'm actually feeling really good today, or I'm feeling a bit low today. And it allows me to really feel where I am. And that allows me to like effectively deal with the world in a more like self-aware way. So I try to do it every day for at least 5 minutes, and then if I have more time to play around with, then I'll do for longer. But it's just getting that moment of like peace before you start dealing with emails and Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of crazy stuff, that you're just like, okay, it's just me and my breath right now, and that really works for me. It's really good.
That daily check-in, where am I right now?
Yeah, 100%.
Amazing. And listen, I have to. There's a question I have to ask. I ask all of my guests because there's a mindfulness side to this podcast and mindful living. And the reason I always ask it is because I love the fact that everybody who practices meditation or practices mindfulness, they always have a different interpretation. And anyone that doesn't practice and is a beginner, they think that it's one certain way. It's a monk sitting in a corner going and it's not.
Yeah.
And so I ask all my guests the question, Daragh, what does mindful living mean to you?
I think, to be very simple, it means being present or trying to be present. And I've actually written an essay about this recently, and so it's been on my mind. But I think it's just actively, as much as you can, trying not to focus on the past, not to focus on the future, and just be where you are now, whatever's going on. And that can happen like in broader circumstances, like you're just focusing on the project you're working on now. But even if you're washing a cup, that you're actually focusing on washing the cup, and then you're brushing your teeth, you're actually focusing on that rather than your thoughts being somewhere else, and just bringing the focus to the present moment. I think that for me is what mindfulness is, and it's hard to get to, and often it's you don't even realize that you're not doing it because you're away somewhere. But I find when I get to those moments, that's when there's zero anxiety, there's zero worrying about what other people think or what other people are doing. It's just being extremely present, and I think that is something to work towards. It's an aspiration for me, as it should be for everyone. But I think that's what mindfulness is: just being extremely present.
Powerful. And it's important to say like that it's not easy. And like I think the most powerful part of mindfulness is actually the acknowledgement is that we're going off track and we're coming back. We're
Mm-hmm.
going off track. And when the mind wanders, just without judgment, just bringing it back and just realizing that, yeah, listen, things aren't working right now, but let's just get back on track.
Mm-hmm.
Um, listen, Dar, I've loved chatting to you and opening this conversation. And there's people that mightn't be too familiar with you. So I know your book is Lonely Boy, and
Mm-hmm.
your blog is Thoughts Too Big. If people want to contact you or follow the blog, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, so Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Daragh Fleming. The blog also has an Instagram, which is at Thoughts Too Big, and the blog's website is thoughtstoobig.ie. So it's all quite streamlined. But yeah, no, really appreciate you having me on. It was a great chat, and yeah, just thank you so much.
No problem at all. And what I'll do is I'll get all the links and I'll put them on our show notes as well. And I'll put a link in this episode. You'll see them up above in the description, so that you can connect with Dara. And let's keep the conversation going. And if you're a company or anyone out there that wants to, are you still doing talks for people as well, or
Yeah,
is that
yeah.
another thing? Yeah. So if you reach out and if I'm down in Cork, I'll meet up and maybe even drink a pint of Murphy's. I don't know if I stoop that low now, but
Very good. Yeah, no, if you're ever down, give me a shout, and we'll definitely grab a drink. 100%.
yeah, no, that's it. Listen, great to talk to you, and thank you so much for being on the Mindful Living Guide. So there you have our interview with Daragh Fleming. I really, really enjoyed that conversation, and it was really because it was the openness of the whole conversation and the fact that accepting that we need to have these conversations in public to allow other people to look for help. Like Dara is very similar to myself. We didn't ask for help until we had to, which I really think we have to change. And then when people feel, oh, geez, I don't feel myself. I don't feel right. It's not. I'm not. I'm. That, I've got that numbness that we talked about. That at that point they can go and seek help. I'm actually going to put in the show notes as well, some signposting as well for people that feel like that they would like to speak to someone else or see look for more help. Like I say, always there's many professionals out there, and there's many things to try. And don't be afraid to try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. So listen, I've been Stephen Downey. This has been a Mindful Living Guide, and I am so happy I am back.